These men were not faceless soldiers. They were young, trained, and shaped by a world far removed from the fields and fences of rural America. Most of the Luftwaffe pilots captured at that time were in their early 20s, though a few seasoned officers in their late 20s or early 30s carried the weight of experience in their eyes. From adolescence, their lives had been meticulously structured to serve the Reich. Hours spent in flight simulators, in classrooms, and in the skies, mastering every maneuver, every tactic, every protocol. By the time they were deployed, each pilot was as much a product of engineering and training as he was of ideology. Their motivations were complex, a mix of national pride, personal ambition, and, for some, an ingrained sense of duty that had been carefully nurtured since their teenage years. From the very start, their world was one of extremes, the exhilaration of flight intertwined with the omnipresent shadow of death. Military culture in Germany emphasized absolute discipline, precision, and obedience. To question orders was to invite scorn or punishment. To falter in skill or commitment was considered not just personal failure, but a threat to the greater mission. They had been indoctrinated to see the enemy as a faceless, impersonal force, to suppress compassion in favor of efficiency, and to treat every mission as a life-or-death calculation. Every aerial engagement reinforced this worldview. Split-second decisions determined whether a squadron returned safely or plummeted in flames. In the days leading to their capture, the pilots had flown some of the most harrowing missions of their careers. They had scrambled at dawn to intercept Allied bombers, navigating skies thick with anti-aircraft fire while engines roared and instruments trembled under the strain. Some had witnessed friends torn from the air by sudden explosions, leaving behind only smoke trails and the hollow echo of loss. Others had returned from reconnaissance flights to find their bases under attack, their meticulously maintained aircraft riddled with shrapnel. Each mission left them more exhausted, more wary, and more acutely aware that a single misstep could end their lives. The tension of constant vigilance became almost second nature, an invisible cord binding each man to the relentless rhythm of survival. It was within this crucible of training, ideology, and near-constant peril that they approached the American POW camp. Hardened by combat, yet still young enough to feel the raw pulse of fear and anticipation, they were unprepared for the surreal contrast awaiting them. The lives they had known, governed by fear, strict hierarchy, and unyielding mission objectives, stood in stark opposition to the calm civility that greeted them now. In the minds of these pilots, every interaction was a test, every gesture a potential threat. And yet, as they stepped across the threshold of the camp, the tension of their last missions, the fiery skies, the loss of comrades, the narrow margins between life and death, followed them, quietly setting the stage for the bewildering experience that would challenge everything they had been taught to expect. The moments leading to their capture were chaotic, raw, and suffused with adrenaline. One pilot, a young lieutenant named Fritz, had been chasing a formation of Allied bombers across a cloud-choked sky when the sharp crack of anti-aircraft fire shredded his wing. His plane shuddered violently, metal groaning under the stress, and for a breathless instant, time seemed suspended. Around him, the sky was a blur of smoke trails and evasive maneuvers, the cacophony of engines and distant explosions blending into a deafening roar. Another, Oberleutnant Klaus, had been forced to abandon a high-altitude engagement after his instruments failed mid-dive. He had spiraled down, barely regaining control before crash-landing in a frost-bitten field. Some pilots surrendered reluctantly, hands raised, faces pressed against the cold fuselage of their planes, knowing that to resist further would mean certain death. When the surviving pilots were rounded up by American forces, they were marched in small, disoriented groups toward the POW camp. The journey itself was disarming. Guards spoke in calm, clipped tones, issuing instructions without a hint of malice, their boots crunching rhythmically against the dirt roads. "Keep moving, Herr Lieutenant. You'll have quarters soon," one guard said, his English accented but deliberate, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Fritz blinked, startled, unsure whether to answer or remain silent. The air smelled of pine and smoke, a strange, almost domestic scent that contrasted sharply with the acrid tang of aviation fuel and gunpowder still clinging to their uniforms. Upon entering the camp, the pilots were struck by its layout. Neatly arranged barracks, orderly mess halls, and wide, open courtyards, each space buzzing with understated efficiency rather than the oppressive vigilance they had anticipated. Guards moved among them with relaxed confidence, pausing to nod or offer terse instructions. One younger American guard chuckled at a pilot tripping over his own boots and quipped, "First day nerves, huh?" The remark, light and teasing, sent a ripple of confusion through the Luftwaffe men. They had expected shouted orders, barking commands, perhaps even immediate confinement under harsh scrutiny. Instead, there was a curious air of respect, a strange civility that unsettled them. Inside the barracks, their confusion deepened. The pilots were shown to simple bunks, offered blankets, and permitted brief rest before a sparse but sufficient meal was provided. Dialogue between the captives and their captors began cautiously, with Fritz asking in halting English, "You not punish us?" The American guard responded evenly, "You're our prisoners, not our enemies here. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine." The incredulity in the German pilots' eyes was palpable. They had been trained to assume hostility at every turn. Every gesture, an offered cup of water, a polite nod, a smile, felt foreign, almost disorienting. Psychologically, the pilots oscillated between disbelief and suspicion. Memories of recent dogfights and narrow escapes flickered through their minds, each pilot replaying last-moment decisions and comrades lost. Could this kindness be a trap? Was every polite word hiding malice? Their training urged caution, but their lived experience, a lifetime of strict hierarchy, indoctrination, and immediate threats, clashed with the reality of their treatment. As night fell over the camp, the men lay on their bunks, uneasy yet inexplicably safe, pondering the perplexing paradox that the Americans, who should have been merciless enemies, instead greeted them with civility and even small gestures of humor. The tension between expectation and reality set the tone for what would follow. A slow, almost imperceptible dismantling of assumptions, a series of lessons in humanity that no flight maneuver or strategic calculation had ever prepared them for. The first night at the camp was not one of comfort, but it was the beginning of a strange awakening, where the routines of war met the unexpected rhythms of decency and curiosity. The Americans' approach to handling prisoners was deliberate, disciplined, yet disarmingly humane, a philosophy rooted in both international law and a broader sense of ethical duty. The Geneva Convention, which Germany and the United States had both ratified, provided clear guidelines for the treatment of POWs, but in practice, the officers and guards at this camp went further than mere compliance. From the moment the Luftwaffe pilots arrived, they encountered a military culture that prioritized order without cruelty. Guards addressed each man by rank or surname, issued instructions with calm clarity, and maintained boundaries without intimidation. It was efficiency intertwined with courtesy, a careful balance that often left the German men both confused and intrigued. Meals were one of the earliest and most striking examples of this approach. Instead of being herded into crowded, grim dining halls, the pilots were shown to tables, each provided with a tray of food, supplemented by coffee or tea. "Eat well," one guard encouraged with a nod. "You'll need strength tomorrow." For Fritz and Klaus, accustomed to the austere, command-driven meals of German bases, where silence was enforced and any hesitation could be met with sharp reprimand, this gesture felt almost absurdly generous. Some pilots exchanged wary glances, as if expecting a hidden inspection or punitive trap. Yet nothing came. The meals were unhurried, the guards patient, and the atmosphere calm. Small freedoms further unsettled the Germans' expectations. Pilots were permitted to walk within designated courtyards, engage in conversation with each other, or even request reading material. One guard lent a book to a pilot who had asked in broken English, saying, "It's yours for the week. Treat it well." Such gestures, seemingly minor, carried an invisible weight. For men trained to anticipate authoritarian oversight and immediate consequence, the very act of being trusted with a book or allowed to move freely was revolutionary. Curiosity began to creep in, replacing the initial disbelief. They observed the Americans' relaxed demeanor, noting that smiles were not merely polite masks but genuine expressions of cordiality. Discipline within the camp was firm but fundamentally different from what the Germans knew. Orders were obeyed not out of fear of punishment, but because structure was practical and mutually beneficial. A command to report for roll call was followed swiftly, but there were no shouted insults, no humiliating drills, no lingering aura of menace. The contrast with German military culture, where hierarchy, fear, and absolute obedience dominated, was jarring. Klaus whispered to Fritz one evening, "In our bases, a mistake like today's would have cost a man his dignity, or worse." Fritz only nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of awe and confusion. Gradually, the Luftwaffe pilots' skepticism gave way to curiosity. They began to observe patterns, how the Americans maintained morale, how guards interacted with prisoners with a careful mixture of firmness and respect, and how small acts of kindness, offered meals, shared jokes, a nod of recognition, were consistent, not anomalies. Even simple courtesies, like being allowed to speak freely during brief walks, seemed designed to preserve human dignity rather than suppress it. Over time, what had begun as a source of disbelief transformed into quiet reflection. The pilots could not yet fully understand the philosophy behind it, but they were increasingly aware of the subtle power in civility, of the strange effectiveness of treating captives as human beings rather than mere tools or obstacles. By the end of the first week, the initial tension and mistrust had begun to soften, replaced by a tentative acknowledgement that the Americans' methods were not only unfamiliar but also unexpectedly effective. The contrast between the fear-driven obedience of their own military and the orderly, humane environment of the camp created a profound internal conflict. Each small act of courtesy chipped away at their assumptions, sparking questions they had never dared to ask before. Could discipline exist without fear? Could kindness coexist with authority? These reflections would grow steadily, shaping the pilot's perceptions in ways that no combat mission or doctrinal lecture ever had. Life in the camp settled into a rhythm that, at first, seemed almost alien to the Luftwaffe pilots. Days began with roll call, a formal yet unobtrusive ritual that replaced the rigid, fear-driven inspections of their prior military experience. Each man lined up, standing at attention as the guards counted heads, but the atmosphere was far from tense. A quiet nod, a polite "good morning," and then the line dispersed, leaving the prisoners to their routines. Meals followed, served on orderly trays with modest but sufficient portions. Fritz marveled at the predictability of it all, the absence of shouting, the calm efficiency, and began to realize that stability itself could be a kind of discipline, one rooted in respect rather than intimidation. Beyond the essentials of food and order, prisoners were granted time for recreation and personal pursuits. Soccer matches in the courtyards drew clusters of men from different squadrons, their competitive spirit mixing seamlessly with laughter and camaraderie. Others passed the hours writing letters to families back home, painstakingly choosing words that might bridge the vast gulf of war. Some shared reading material or debated news from distant fronts, creating pockets of intellectual engagement amidst confinement. Even minor chores, such as maintaining barracks or assisting with camp gardens, were framed not as punishment but as opportunities to contribute, fostering a sense of purpose. Social dynamics among the prisoners quickly evolved. Friendships formed around shared experiences and mutual understanding, while hierarchies emerged naturally, reflecting rank and competence rather than coercion. Yet tension occasionally flared, particularly when younger pilots chafed against the older officers' authority or when conflicting personalities collided in the confined spaces of the barracks. Fritz observed one such dispute over sleeping arrangements, where a heated argument between two unterleutnants was diffused not through threats, but through the intervention of a senior officer, who calmly negotiated a compromise. The resolution was instructive. Authority in the camp operated on reason and negotiation, not fear. American officers played a subtle but pivotal role in shaping daily life. They circulated among the prisoners, checking on well-being, offering advice, and gently correcting breaches of conduct. When one pilot attempted to hoard extra rations, an officer quietly intervened, explaining that fairness to all prisoners was the priority. There was no scolding, only firm guidance delivered with an understanding of human dignity. Such interactions, repeated over days and weeks, slowly eroded the pilots' skepticism. They began to see that order could coexist with kindness, that rules did not require cruelty to be effective. Cultural misunderstandings, while inevitable, became moments of connection rather than conflict. Fritz once attempted to respond to a friendly joke with a formal salute, eliciting a burst of laughter and a playful correction. "Relax, Lieutenant. Just a smile will do." Another pilot, Klaus, accidentally used a German expression in a conversation with a guard, prompting amused clarification rather than reprimand. These small exchanges, seemingly trivial, accumulated over time, fostering mutual trust and, in some cases, genuine fondness. Gradually, the Luftwaffe men came to appreciate the subtleties of their captors' approach, the careful balance of authority, the small courtesies, and the persistent recognition of their humanity. In this structured yet humane environment, the pilots began to navigate a world that operated on rules they had never known could be compassionate, discovering that routine itself could be both stabilizing and surprisingly generous. Even as daily routines settled into a predictable rhythm, the Luftwaffe pilots struggled to comprehend the underlying philosophy of their captors. Smiles, casual laughter, and seemingly minor gestures of kindness were inconceivable within the framework of German military culture, where fear and strict hierarchy dictated behavior. Fritz recorded in his small, worn notebook one evening, "I do not understand these men. They greet us as if we were friends, yet they are our enemies. Are they mocking us? Or is this some kind of trap?" The entry captured the tension between what the pilots had been taught to expect, constant suspicion and hostility, and the reality of the Americans' conduct, which seemed almost blasphemous to their conditioned instincts. The psychological impact of this cultural dissonance was profound. For years, the pilots had been indoctrinated to believe that human decency could be suspended in wartime, that compassion was a luxury they could neither afford nor trust. Every aerial combat mission reinforced the notion that mercy was weakness, and every disciplinary measure back home confirmed that obedience under fear was the only reliable path to survival. Yet in the camp, they encountered a startling contradiction: authority exercised with restraint, rules enforced with fairness, and genuine human connection tolerated even in captivity. The result was disorientation, a gnawing sense that their moral compass, once rigidly aligned with military doctrine, was being recalibrated by forces they had never experienced. Guilt also weighed heavily on the pilots' minds. They had seen destruction from above, had participated in missions that left entire towns scarred, civilians displaced, and friends dead. One diary entry from Klaus read, "I flew over villages and left them in flames. Now I am treated with food, warmth, and smiles. Am I unworthy of such care? And yet I cannot ask for it, for I have done what I have done." The juxtaposition of their past actions with the Americans' humane treatment created a cognitive dissonance that was impossible to ignore. Each polite gesture from a guard, each patient explanation of a rule, became a mirror reflecting their own internal contradictions, forcing them to confront questions they had previously suppressed. What does it mean to be human in war? Can decency exist amidst duty and destruction? Gradually, suspicion gave way to comprehension, though not without conflict. The pilots began to notice patterns in behavior, small consistencies that hinted at intentional moral principles rather than random kindness. They saw that smiles were not mere social niceties but a deliberate affirmation of humanity, that laughter was not flippancy but an acknowledgement of shared circumstance. Fritz wrote, I begin to see that these men are not weak. Their strength lies in restraint, in seeing us not merely as enemies but as men. I do not yet understand it fully, but it unsettles me in ways I cannot dismiss. The camp environment became a laboratory for self-reflection. Pilots who once measured worth in skill and obedience now measured it against patience, empathy, and moral courage. The clash of cultures, German rigidity against American humanism, produced a slow but undeniable transformation. What had begun as incredulity evolved into curiosity, and curiosity, in turn, sparked a profound internal dialogue. Each pilot wrestled with the realization that decency and duty were not mutually exclusive, that respect and authority could coexist, and that a simple smile might hold more power than the sharpest command. By the end of their first month, the cultural and psychological impact of this environment had settled into the pilots' consciousness. They still bore the weight of their past, still struggled with guilt and indoctrination, but a seed of understanding had been planted, that the human heart could persist even amidst war, and that true strength might be measured not in fear imposed, but in trust extended. By the time the Luftwaffe pilots had spent several months in the camp, the cumulative impact of humane treatment was undeniable. What had initially seemed inconceivable, a prison defined by civility, smiles, and genuine concern, had gradually reshaped their perception of both their captors and themselves. Where they had once anticipated fear, suspicion, and hostility, they found consistency, respect, and measured authority. This treatment not only eased the daily stress of captivity, but also instilled a subtle form of morale that neither threats nor punishments could have achieved. Even in confinement, the pilots began to reclaim a sense of dignity, understanding that their humanity remained intact despite the circumstances. The contrast between German and American military cultures became starkly evident. In Germany, discipline had been maintained through fear, indoctrination, and rigid hierarchies. Mistakes were punished, obedience was demanded, and the emotional life of the soldier was subordinated to the mission. In the American system they now experienced, structure and order existed in tandem with empathy, fairness, and mutual respect. The psychological consequences were profound. German soldiers, conditioned to operate under constant tension, were often rigid and anxious, while American soldiers and officers cultivated resilience through trust, adaptability, and recognition of the individual. For the captured pilots, this difference sparked a profound internal reflection on the nature of authority, strength, and leadership. Some pilots went further, internalizing lessons that would shape their post-war attitudes. Fritz, for example, later recounted how witnessing consistent fairness and civility transformed his understanding of what a soldier could be. He described a growing desire to advocate for reconciliation, to challenge the narrative that enemies must always be feared or dehumanized. Klaus reflected similarly, noting that simple gestures of kindness had far greater power than coercion ever could, planting seeds for empathy that endured long after the war's end. For these men, captivity became less a punishment and more an education in moral courage and shared humanity. Ultimately, the story's emotional core lies in this revelation. Even amid the brutality of global conflict, the capacity for decency and mutual respect persisted. Smiles, polite words, and measured discipline became instruments of unexpected influence, demonstrating that war does not necessitate the abandonment of fundamental human values. The pilot's reflections reveal that the simple acknowledgement of another's dignity, through food, conversation, or trust, can break down barriers imposed by ideology, fear, and tradition. In these quiet yet transformative months, the Luftwaffe pilots discovered that the enemy was not merely the other nation or its soldiers, but the limitations imposed by rigid thinking and fear. By witnessing American military culture, they came to understand that strength and compassion are not mutually exclusive, and that reconciliation, even in the aftermath of conflict, begins with the recognition of shared humanity. The experiences of these men stand as a testament to the enduring power of respect and empathy, suggesting that even the harshest conditions cannot entirely suppress the human capacity for understanding, kindness, and moral insight. The sun dipped low over the camp, casting long shadows across the neatly raked courtyards, as the Luftwaffe pilots gathered for the evening roll call. Yet this time, the scene was transformed, not by authority or command, but by understanding. Fritz exchanged a brief, unspoken glance with Klaus, and both men smiled, a quiet acknowledgment of the lessons they had learned. The Americans, standing nearby, returned the gesture with gentle nods, recognizing that respect had passed both ways. The rigid tension that had defined their first days, the suspicion, the mistrust, the uncertainty, was now tempered by comprehension and a shared, if fragile, human connection. In these moments, the complexity of war was laid bare. The pilots remembered the chaos of their last missions, the roar of engines, the flash of anti-aircraft fire, and the loss of comrades. And yet, amid memories of destruction, they now experienced the unexpected power of kindness and fairness. The simple gestures of the guards, polite words, offered meals, freedom to walk, moments of humor, were no longer confusing. They were intentional acts, rooted in a philosophy that saw captives as humans first, enemies second. Humility and respect had replaced fear as the foundation of their daily lives. As night settled, the pilots returned to their bunks, carrying with them a quiet realization that human decency could endure even in the harshest circumstances, that courage could manifest not only in combat but in moral restraint, and that empathy could bridge divides forged in fire and ideology. They had come as adversaries, steeped in suspicion and indoctrination, but they would leave with an understanding far deeper than strategy or rank, that even in war, respect, compassion, and shared humanity could illuminate a path beyond enmity. The camp, its routines, and its people had imparted a lesson that would outlast the conflict itself, a testament to the enduring strength of human decency.